Let's delve into the case of a serial killer who, after being convicted of murder, cleverly manipulated the media and authorities into granting him an early release. He would go on to claim another 11 lives, his genius cover story deflecting all suspicion. This is the story of Jacques Unterweger. To understand how he became a serial killer and outsmarted law enforcement, one must look at his past. Violence was a constant presence in his life. As a teenager, he was an angry young man with a deep-seated hatred for women. He habitually carried a steel rod, ready to threaten or assault prostitutes and their pimps at a moment's notice. His series of heinous crimes against women began at the age of 24. On the cold night of May 13, 1974, in Salzburg, Austria, Jacques Unterweger sat in his car, his mind racing with dark thoughts as he searched for his next victim. He soon spotted a woman shivering on the side of the road, waiting for a ride. Her name was Daphne. Jack drove over and offered her a lift to the train station, which she accepted. The woman stepped into his vehicle, completely unaware she had just entered the devil's car. They drove in silence along a deserted road. Suddenly, the tires spun in the mud, and the car became stuck. I'll get us out," Jack muttered, though he had no intention of doing so. Instead of inspecting the problem, he began to look at her strangely, as if sizing her up. A sense of dread washed over Daphne, and she reached for the door handle. In that instant, Jack struck her over the head. Her head spun, and her vision blurred. Before she could scream, he was upon her, tying her hands behind her back with an intricate signature knot, one hand, then the other bound together. Daphne struggled, but Jack shoved her back into the car, crushing her with his weight to hold her down. She felt something cold and hard against her skin. A steel rod. Jack ran it over her body, and her face turned white with fear. In one swift movement, he ripped her clothes off. He then proceeded to violate her with the rod while pleasuring himself with his other hand. Savoring her terror, when he was finished, he leaned in close and whispered, "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" She shook her head, too terrified to speak. But fate intervened. Another car approached, and a stranger pulled alongside, asking if she needed help. Daphne bolted, throwing herself into the Good Samaritan's car and screaming, "Drive now." Jack watched as she disappeared down the road. It wasn't long before he was arrested, with a witness and clear evidence of the assault. The case was straightforward. He was found guilty and sentenced to his first stint behind bars. Within days, Jack devised a plan to escape his cell for a more comfortable situation. He quickly identified the key inmates and found someone to help him smuggle in a jar of painkillers. He began swallowing them, one by one, until he lost count. The act had to look like a convincing suicide attempt to the guards. His vision blurred and he finally passed out. When he was found, he was moved to a psychiatric facility, having been deemed unfit for a regular prison. He had successfully convinced the justice system that he was mentally unstable, with no one realizing he had orchestrated the entire event. A few months later, the monster was released back into the world, where he would continue to deceive the police and everyone around him. He didn't last a full year before committing another crime. This time, however, he wouldn't leave a witness. He now operated with the knowledge that he could manipulate his way out of trouble if caught. On December 11, 1974, in Germany, Jack and his then-girlfriend, Barbara, were on their way to her parents' house with a plan to steal cash. When they arrived, the house was locked, and her parents were asleep. Jack slammed his fist against the door in frustration. They needed a new plan. Just then, he spotted a young girl across the road, a twisted look forming in his eyes. "Let's rob someone," he said to Barbara, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Barbara, a quiet girl who rarely argued, did not object. They turned their attention to their unfortunate victim, Margaret Schaefer, an 18-year-old neighbor of Barbara's. As Margaret walked toward her house, Barbara called out, inviting her to hang out. Margaret hesitated, but being a teenager, she was easily convinced by the offer of a late-night drive. She climbed into Jack's car, a decision that would cost her her life. Jack drove to a secluded spot near a bar. "Get in the front," he ordered. Before Margaret could react, Jack grabbed her, yanking her forward and binding her wrists in his signature knot while Barbara watched in silence. Jack rifled through Margaret's purse but found only pocket change. "You have more money at home," he demanded. Margaret nodded, shaking. Jack drove back to her house, and Barbara went inside using Margaret's key, taking cash, clothes, and some snacks. But Jack wanted more. As he drove deep into the woods, Margaret started to scream. He stopped the car and pushed her out. Snow crunched beneath their feet as he ordered her to remove her clothes. Barbara remained in the car. Jack stood over Margaret, watching her tremble in the freezing air, savoring the moment. Then, methodically, he raised the steel rod and brought it down on her. Margaret collapsed, blood staining the snow. But the monster wasn't finished. He picked up her bra, wrapped it around her neck, and squeezed. She clawed at him, fighting for her life. But he was too strong. Jack choked her until the light vanished from her eyes. Once she fell limp, he let her go, kicked her body to the side, and got back into the car. Just like that, he drove away, leaving her lifeless body in the icy forest. They tossed the steel rod and dumped her clothes, but kept her fur coat. Margaret's body lay in the woods for 3 weeks before it was discovered by hunters. No one could identify the perpetrator until a little over a month later, when Barbara was arrested for an unrelated crime. The police ran a routine check on her boyfriend, Jacques Unterweger, and discovered his record of violence against women. They began questioning Barbara about him, asking if he had ever been violent with her or others. At first, she refused to talk, but eventually her guilt overwhelmed her and she cracked. "Jack killed my neighbor, Margaret." Given his record, the police believed her immediately. Jack was arrested and, under interrogation, openly admitted to the crime. He claimed it was a fit of rage and that he saw his own mother's face as he killed her. A psychiatric evaluation produced a long list of issues. Jack was egocentric, aggressive, sadistic, unpredictable, and most importantly, incurable. The court agreed on June 1st, 1976. Jacques Unterweger was sentenced to life in prison. This should have been the end of his story. Instead, it was the beginning of his longest con, a deception that would fool the public and the justice system for years. Jack had never been well educated, but in prison, he had an abundance of time. He spent hours in the library, teaching himself to read and write. He earned his diploma and then began writing his own dark stories. Somehow, he got published, even writing for a children's radio show called the Bedtime Program for Little Ones. From there, he gained the confidence to write an autobiography. This masterpiece, which he titled Faggy Fair, or Purgatory, would change everything. The book became an instant bestseller, hailed by critics as raw and powerful. Suddenly, Jacques Unterweger was no longer a murderer. He was a misunderstood artist, a man completely transformed. The media devoured the story. Writers, artists, journalists, and even politicians began to protest for his release, advocating not just for his freedom, but for a full pardon. Austrian authorities saw this as a golden opportunity, a shining example of successful prison reform. He went in a killer and came out a poet. No one questioned the actual rehabilitation he had received, whether he had undergone therapy or if he had been treated for his violent urges. The truth, which would later become painfully clear, was that he had not, but it didn't matter. The myth of Jacques Unterweger had been crafted. He was the great Austrian redemption story. On May 23, 1990, after serving just 15 years, Jacques Unterweger was released from prison. The authorities were so proud of their success story that they plastered his release all over the news. In their excitement, they completely neglected to assess whether Jack was actually fit to be reintroduced into society. He was given no parole officer and no psychiatric check-ins. He was a free man, but one with the same unquenchable thirst for violence, and he was ready to kill again. Within months, Jack successfully entered the world of journalism, specializing in investigative reporting. He moved freely through red light districts, questioning prostitutes, interviewing police officers, and writing articles that painted him as a concerned citizen. Then, an opportunity arose. He was assigned to travel to Los Angeles to write a story comparing prostitution in America with that in Europe. On June 11th, 1991, Jack landed at Los Angeles International Airport. Eager for the hunt, he checked into the infamous Cecil Hotel, a building with its own dark history of crime and death. His kind of place. Jack wasted no time. He befriended local police officers, who, thinking he might want to report on LA's rougher districts, even took him on ride-alongs. The officers had no idea they were escorting a serial killer as they patrolled the streets. Then, the killings began. 35-year-old Shannon Exley disappeared first. She had been working near the Cecil Hotel when she got into a car with a charming foreigner. 3 days later, her body was found. She had been beaten, assaulted with a tree branch, and strangled with her own brow. Her hands were tied behind her back in the same meticulous knot Jack had perfected. Next was 33-year-old Irene Rodriguez, followed by 26-year-old Peggy Jean Booth. Each victim was found bound, strangled, and abandoned. The LAPD suspected a serial killer was at large, but had no idea he was already in their midst, playing the role of an investigative journalist, reporting on the very crimes he had committed and controlling the public narrative. Meanwhile, back in Austria, authorities were beginning to link a series of murders back home to Jack, a retired police officer named August Scheiner who had long suspected Jack in an earlier unsolved murder in Salzburg, contacted Vienna investigators. "I know this man," he insisted. "I know how he kills, and I think he's doing it again." In Vienna, Chief Max Edelbacher started connecting the dots, realizing that Jack had been present in nearly every city where prostitutes had disappeared. But Jack was one step ahead. When he got wind of the investigation, he walked into the police station to provide an alibi. His main defense was that he had been with his young girlfriend, Katrina, on the night one of the victims disappeared. But Katrina had brought her personal planner to the interview. Flipping through the pages, she quickly disproved Jack's lie. "Wait," she said. "I wasn't with Jack that night. I was at a social event, and he was supposed to be in Graz doing a reading." The case was blown wide open. The courts in Graz issued an arrest warrant for Jack on suspicion of murder. But someone leaked the news before authorities could take him into custody. Jack was on the run. Investigators searched his apartment and found a shotgun, handcuffs, a switchblade, and most incriminatingly, his financial records. Because Jack had received government subsidies for his writing, he had kept detailed receipts of all his expenses, gas receipts and hotel stays, showed that Jack had been in the exact locations where the women had disappeared, at the exact times they vanished. But Jack was gone. Authorities suspected he had fled to Switzerland or Italy, but he was nowhere to be found. Then, on February 20th, he called the media, playing the victim. "I'm innocent. The police are framing me. It's a witch hunt," he claimed, his voice calm and almost too confident. Over the next few days, the media turned the case into a spectacle, questioning whether Jack was truly guilty. What no one could deny, however, was that since Jack had disappeared, the killings had stopped. On February 15th, 1992, Jack arrived in Switzerland and convinced his girlfriend Bianca to flee with him, feeding her a story about a corrupt cop in Salzburg framing him for murder. They made their way to New York City and then booked another flight to their final destination, Miami. With only $1,200 to their names, Jack, ever the survivor, found them a one-bedroom apartment for just $315 a month. The landlord simply wanted 2 months' rent up front, which they managed to provide. Bianca found a job as a go-go dancer at a local club, likely getting paid in cash tips. But Jack had grown accustomed to being the hero, and wasn't content living like a rat. He devised a plan. One day, he picked out a payphone on a busy Miami street and called a contact in the Austrian media. A few moments later, he was live on air, repeating his story of being a victim of a biased justice system. The call lasted 7 minutes, long enough for Austrian authorities to trace his location. But Jack knew this. As he hung up, he glanced around, feeling untouchable in a city of hundreds of thousands. His biggest threat, however, wasn't law enforcement. It was his own girlfriend. Back at their cramped apartment, Bianca was flipping through a newspaper when a story about her caught her eye. reporting that friends and family feared she was in danger. Guilt twisted in her stomach. "I have to call my mother," she said firmly. Jack's expression darkened. "That's not a good idea," he warned, his tone calm but his eyes sharp. Bianca ignored him. She later slipped out, found a phone booth, and made the call. "Mama, I'm okay," she whispered quickly before the call was cut off. Whether it was a bad connection or something more sinister, she had gotten her message across, and in doing so, allowed the police to trace her location. Meanwhile, back in Austria, a journalist named Elizabeth, still under Jack's spell, had been sending him money and his thyroid medication. When her funds ran low, she turned to her boss, who agreed to wire Jack $10,000 in exchange for an exclusive interview about life on the run. Jack was thrilled. He had big plans for a new life. What he didn't know was that his benefactor had never trusted him. The journalist met with Austrian investigators on February 26th, handing over a crucial piece of paper with the address of a money exchange in Miami Beach, where Jack was to pick up the money. There was no time to involve Interpol. U.S. Marshals had to act fast. 4 agents staked out the location. At exactly 11 a.m., Jack and Bianca walked toward the exchange. Jack spotted the agents immediately, but didn't change his course. Cool and collected, he leaned against a wall, while Bianca went inside. The marshals took their positions. As Bianca came out and handed Jack the envelope, they started to walk away. Then, Jack bolted into an alley. One of the marshals gave chase. Jack wasn't fast enough. The officer slammed him to the ground, twisting his arms behind his back. "You're done, Unterweger," the marshal said as he snapped the handcuffs shut. Bianca, wide-eyed and shaking, was also taken into custody, but was released after a search of their apartment yielded nothing concrete. The next day, she boarded a plane back to Austria, still convinced of Jack's innocence. Jack, however, faced bigger problems. California authorities considered keeping him to stand trial for the 3 Los Angeles prostitute murders, a crime for which he could receive the death penalty. Jack claimed he could see the electric chair from his holding cell in Miami. Fearing execution in America, he waived his right to fight extradition and agreed to return to Austria. He stepped onto Austrian soil once again, not as a celebrated writer, but as a hunted man. In Austria, Jack kept insisting on his innocence. He produced a hotel receipt to prove his whereabouts when one of the victims disappeared on October 26. Investigators, however, discovered that while he had paid for the room on the 26th and 27th, he hadn't actually checked in until the 27th. This meant he could have easily been in Grays, less than 2 hours away, on the night the victim went missing. During his trial, his lies began to fall apart. He claimed to be on the phone with a woman named Karen when another victim vanished. At first, Karen didn't remember the date, but by the time she was on the witness stand, she was suddenly certain it was the evening of April 8th. When the prosecutor asked how she was so sure, she replied, "Because I meditated on it." The prosecution then produced a letter Karen had sent Jack in prison, asking him what she should say to help him. Another woman Jack claimed as an alibi couldn't even remember which night it was. On top of that, forensic experts found fibers on one victim that matched a scarf and pants in Jack's closet. Traces of type B blood were found under another victim's fingernails. Jack's blood type, the biggest shock, came when a single blonde hair found in Jack's car was confirmed through DNA testing to be Bianca's. While this only proved she had been in his car, Jack had been so hell-bent on denying it that the lie made the evidence far more suspicious. The trial ended with Jack being found guilty on 9 out of 11 murder charges. 2 of the victims' bodies were too decomposed for a certain conviction. Jack stood there, cocky as ever, and smirked that he would appeal. But that appeal never came. The next day, Jack was found dead in his cell. He had used a shoelace and a string from his pants to hang himself. The noose was tied with the exact same knot he had used to strangle all of his victims. On July 15, 1997, news of Gianni Versace's sudden death threw the media into chaos. Every headline was the same: Gianni Versace shot dead on the steps of his Miami mansion in broad daylight. The killer was a mastermind named Andrew Cunanan. This is the story of the infamous Versace killer. Andrew Cunanan was born on August 31st, 1969, in National City, California. He grew up as an intelligent and sought-after child. On paper, the Cunanan household looked like a dream. Situated in the affluent neighborhood of Rancho Bernardo, Andrew was the golden child, his father's favorite of 4 children. Everyone believed he was destined for great things. With an IQ of 120, just 18 points below Einstein's, he could officially be labeled a genius. He was also incredibly popular at school, known as the most fun person to be around. He once showed up to a formal event in a tight red leather jumpsuit, while everyone else was in suits and ties, loving the attention. In his yearbook, he was named most likely to never be forgotten, a prediction that proved chillingly accurate. He was, in all the ways that mattered, perfect. This external validation led to an obsession with maintaining that perfect appearance. But he harbored a secret that was eating him up inside. He was gay. He felt he could never tell his family, not because they wouldn't accept him, but because he couldn't bear the thought of not being completely perfect. He had to keep up the golden boy act, an act that slowly began to drive him mad. There are reports that in 1996, Andrew called a hotline for survivors of sexual violence, claiming he had been abused by a priest as a child when he was an altar boy. This suggests he was dealing with dark, sinister trauma beneath the surface, which would later manifest in the most destructive ways. By age 19, Andrew was on top of the world. He was handsome, fluent in French, could distinguish good wine from bad, and could hold intellectual conversations on philosophy, history, and politics. He was the kind of person who could charm a senator and a movie star in the same evening. On paper, he was perfect. But then, his perfect life came crashing down. His father, his hero, was caught embezzling money. The fairy tale ended abruptly. Rather than face charges, his father fled to the Philippines, leaving the family broke and humiliated. Andrew decided to follow him, only to find the man he idolized living in squalor, broke, powerless, and a fraud. Andrew realized his whole life had been a lie. The golden boy mask began to slip. He returned to the States, angry, disappointed, and changed. He fought with his mother, shoving her so hard she hit a wall and dislocated her shoulder. Stressed about his future, Andrew looked for the quickest way up the social and financial ladder. He dropped out of college, abandoned his family, and moved to San Francisco, where he began working as an escort. He was selective, catering to a client list of rich, older men who bought him Rolexes and paid his rent just to keep him around. Andrew was handsome, smart, and cultured, playing the role of a high-end companion perfectly. He didn't just sleep with these men. He studied them, learning how the rich moved, talked, and dressed. Slowly, he climbed the ladder, claiming to hang out with celebrities like Madonna, John Travolta, Tom Cruise, and Leonardo DiCaprio. Whether any of it was true is unknown, but Andrew was a smooth talker who could make people believe anything. He even claimed to have met Gianni Versace at a club in San Francisco. It was there that Andrew's obsession with fame, beauty, and power began. Police would later find a little black book among his belongings containing notes, addresses, and phone numbers for Versace, Madonna, and the others. Whether real or fantasy, it was a kill list, and Versace was at the top. He partied through San Francisco, secretly broke and desperate, but always pretending otherwise. He would strut out of a $1,000 dinner and leave a $200 tip as if he were a millionaire. He wanted his friends to think he was important. It was all about applause and admiration, but the applause was fake, the affection shallow, and the loneliness all too real. By 1996, he was living large again. A retired art dealer let him stay in his mansion, gave him $2,000 a month, and the keys to a flashy sports car, but it was borrowed time. The relationship ended, the money stopped, and the car was taken back. Andrew was sinking fast. In that chaos, 2 names became central to his story: David Madsen and Jeffrey Trail. David Madsen was everything Andrew idolized, a young, brilliant, and successful Minneapolis architect. He was Andrew's lover. Jeffrey Trail was Andrew's best friend, an ex-Navy officer who had supported him for years. These two were more than just clients. They were people Andrew cared about, or so he thought. David eventually ended things when he realized Andrew was being unfaithful. Jeffrey also began to pull away, perhaps seeing through the lies. The moment they stepped out of Andrew's circle, he started to see them as threats. To make matters worse, David and Jeffrey both ended up living in Minnesota, miles from each other, and became friends. This was the final blow. Andrew wasn't just losing people. He was being replaced. Lonelier than ever, he finally snapped. Andrew called David announcing he was coming to visit. Despite everything, David agreed. On April 25, 1997, Andrew arrived in Minneapolis, broke and desperate to reclaim what he'd lost. He even brought a fancy watch as a twisted peace offering. That same weekend, Andrew left a message for Jeffrey inviting him over to David's place. It was the last message Jeffrey Trail would ever receive. When Jeffrey arrived, he walked into a trap. What followed was a brutal beating with a claw hammer, around 30 blows to the head. Days later, after David failed to show up for work, the building superintendent checked the apartment. Inside, he found Jeffrey's body rolled up in a rug. David was gone. At first, police believed Andrew had forced David to flee with him. 2 days later, David Madsen was found dead by the shore of Rush Lake, shot in the back and then through the eye, execution style. The two people Andrew claimed to love most were gone. If he couldn't have them, no one could, and he was just getting started. A week later in Chicago, the wife of real estate mogul Lee Miglin came home to a nightmare. Lee, who was known to have associated with escorts, lay mangled on the floor. His ribs were shattered. He'd been stabbed over 20 times with a screwdriver. His throat had been nearly sawed through, and pruning shears were jammed into his chest. A plastic bag with holes poked in the nostrils had been placed over his face as if Andrew wanted him to stay alive just a little longer. After this horrific act, Andrew went into a bathroom, shaved, made a sandwich, and calmly drove off in Miglin's green Lexus. That car took him to his next target. Days later, in Pennsville, New Jersey, William Reese, a cemetery caretaker, was found dead, shot in the head. It was a clean, efficient kill. There was no connection, no grudge. Andrew simply needed a new vehicle, and William Reese had one. The FBI called it a functional murder. Andrew had now killed 4 men and was heading south to Miami. By now, Andrew Cunanan's face was plastered everywhere. 12 different people reported seeing him in Miami, but authorities seemed to move in slow motion. While the manhunt stumbled, Andrew waited in a cheap Miami hotel room, plotting his grand finale. His target was his idol, the legendary Gianni Versace. On the morning of July 15, 1997, the fashion mogul decided to take a short stroll alone to grab the morning papers. He made it back to the front steps of his mansion, calm and casual. That's when Andrew struck. A bullet tore through Versace's cheek, and another ripped through the back of his head. The fashion world's brightest star was dead. Andrew ran, disappearing into a houseboat where 8 days later he shot himself. The next story is of an English serial killer who took the lives of 8 women in his infamous apartment at 10 Rillington Place, hiding their bodies within its walls. It began in 1899 in Halifax, Yorkshire, where John Reginald Christie was born into a loveless home. His father was cold as ice, his mother overbearing, and Christie spent his childhood in fear, learning early how to stay quiet and lie to stay out of trouble. This shaped him into a master manipulator later in life. Even as a kid, something was wrong. He casually tortured animals and stole from neighbors. Back then, it was dismissed as boys being boys. Nobody saw the darkness brewing inside him. Then came World War I. If John was broken before, the war shattered what was left. A mustard gas attack left him partially mute for a time, but it also gave him a new tool: pity. People let their guard down around him, and Christie learned to use that to his advantage. By the 1930s, he was married to a woman named Ethel and living a quiet life in London. They ended up at a little place in Notting Hill, 10 Rillington Place. No one thought twice about the soft-spoken man in flat number 1. But behind those walls, something twisted was happening. The women he targeted were chosen carefully. Some were sex workers trying to survive in post-war London. Others were young women looking for work, food, or a warm bed, and there were those who came to him for help. Women with nowhere else to turn, desperate for a solution to an unwanted pregnancy, an illness, or just in need of kindness. Christie always had the same answer. Come inside, I can help you. He'd pose as a doctor, or someone with medical knowledge from the war, using fancy phrases and keeping bottles of pills around to sell the illusion. His soft voice and gentle tone made people feel safe. They let their guard down, they believed him, and then the door would shut. The gas would start to hiss. Christie had rewired the gas taps in his kitchen to knock his victims unconscious before he strangled them. It was always the same playbook. He kept their bodies, sometimes for days, hidden in nooks and under floorboards, as if he were collecting them. He enjoyed the control, the fantasy, the power. His wife, Ethel, they say, knew what was going on, but like many women of that era, had nowhere else to go. She stayed quiet. For a while, no one else was aware. Then a man named Timothy Evans moved in upstairs, and the story turns from horrific to tragic. Timothy wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed. He struggled to read and worked odd jobs, telling tall tales to make himself sound important. He was just a kid in a man's body. John Christie, downstairs, seemed helpful and calm, the kind of man you'd trust. Timothy and his wife, Beryl, took him at his word, having no idea what kind of monster lived below them. In 1949, Beryl became pregnant again. With no money to raise another child, the couple was desperate. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. That's when Christie made his move. He told them he could help, that he'd learned medical techniques during the war, and could terminate the pregnancy safely. Timothy was nervous, but Christie was so calm and sure himself that they eventually agreed. On November 8, 1949, Timothy left for work. Beryl stayed behind, but there was no procedure. Christie gassed Beryl in his kitchen with a homemade rubber tube hooked to the gas tap. Once she was unconscious, he strangled her with a rope, just like the others, and hid her body in a cupboard under the sink. Their baby, Geraldine, was still alive, crying for her mother. Christie couldn't leave a witness, so he strangled the child too, a baby barely a year old. When Timothy came home, Christie told him the abortion had gone wrong, and Beryl had died. He claimed he disposed of her body, and that the baby had been taken in by someone who could care for her. Timothy was in shock. Christie warned him not to go to the police, telling him he'd be sent to prison, and that no one would believe him. Timothy left town, but the guilt caught up with him. He went to the police a few weeks later, confused and panicked. His story changed with each telling. The police latched onto his inconsistent confession. They raided Christie's house and found Beryl's body under the sink and baby Geraldine's body in a washhouse. At trial, Christie took the stand, calm and charismatic. He used his manipulative skills to convince the court that Timothy was the killer. In 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged, an innocent man executed for Christie's crimes. 3 more years passed, and Christie kept killing. He murdered his own wife Ethel in 1952, hiding her under the floorboards as well. He invited more women into his flat. More lies, more gas, more death. The horror ended in March 1953, when the landlord, doing some work, ripped open a panel in the kitchen wall, and a body wrapped in blankets slid out. The police were called, and the whole building was searched. They found more corpses in the walls, under the floorboards, and in the garden. It was a house of horrors. John Christie was gone, having vanished into the city. 10 days later, they found him sitting on a bench near Putney Bridge, his pockets stuffed with newspaper clippings about his crimes. He didn't fight or deny it. He confessed. At trial, the nation watched in horror as the truth emerged. 8 murders, possibly more, the wrongful execution of Timothy Evans, and a justice system that had failed catastrophically. In July 1953, John Christie was hanged at Pentonville Prison, the same place where Evans had been killed 3 years earlier. Public outcry over the case was a significant factor that led to the abolition of capital punishment in the UK by the late 1960s. Rillington Place was eventually torn down,